Is space God? Is God space? Is that just a really weird idea? Or might there be something to it? Well, that's what JD Lyonhart's new book, Space God, is all about. Let me tell you what I thought. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I just finished a copy of Space God by JD Lyonhart, put out by Cascade. Thank you to Cascade for sending me a copy for review. This is my honest take on the book. And I should also mention that I have interviewed JD or Jonathan on this channel, and he and I have stayed in touch since then, so I'm grateful for the chance to review this, which is quite different from the first book I read by him called Monotheism, which I loved. This is very, very just a different argument, different style of book, but let me take you through the main idea, the research behind it, the readability of it, and then my reaction to it in general. So let's dive in. So Space God is a book that occupies the overlap of a few different areas of thought, namely physics and kind of metaphysics and theology and history in some ways. It's kind of a intersection of all those ideas, but specifically it's looking at this historic individual named Henry Moore, who I was barely familiar with before I read this. I knew almost nothing about. I heard his name, but I knew almost nothing about him. Jonathan looks at in a way, there's an intellectual biography of Henry Moore presented in this book, and then the second half of the book is kind of a wrestling with the ideas of Henry Moore and relating them to theoretical physics post-Einstein. So the first half of the book, the main idea of this book is essentially let's take Henry Moore's most interesting, provocative, kind of strange idea, which is that the argument of space being divine, of divine space, of the space that we occupy is God. Let's take that idea and let's kind of trace the intellectual history of it in Henry Moore's life. How did that idea get clarified and argued over the course of his life and in his writings? And then how did that idea set the groundwork for Newtonian physics, which then got radically, as most people know, shaken by relative physics introduced by Einstein. And then having gone through all of that, might there still be something to Henry Moore's argument for divine space, given all of these kind of sea changes in the world of physics and theoretical physics? So that's what the book really is about. It's kind of hard to summarize because it's kind of about a lot, but essentially it's in two sections. This biographical, more of an intellectual biography, not like a full life biography of Henry Moore and his ideas about divine space. And then the second half of the book is wrestling with it. What might this mean in our current kind of landscape? Is there a metaphysical, theological argument that actually dovetails with modern physics in a way that might actually kind of bring Henry Moore's odd idea of divine space back to the table? Might it deserve a hearing? It's kind of the central question of Space God of this book is, might Henry Moore's idea deserve a hearing even today, even post-Einstein? So yeah, that's what Space God's about. It's a pretty in some ways this little mind-bending intersection of all these different ideas of kind of deep thought and history and argumentation. So having tried to wrestle that main idea down in a couple minutes, let me dive into the next areas, which are first research and then readability. So the research behind this is, man, it's really impressive. Maybe I'm just impressed because I didn't know anything about Henry Moore, but I'm really impressed by JD Lyonhart's ability to pour through the primary writings, especially of Henry Moore. So this first half of the book, which he even says in the introduction, if you're not that interested, I'll say more about this in my reaction, if you're not that interested in the biographical material of Henry Moore, you can probably skip that first half. I found it quite interesting, but I'm really impressed by, in that section specifically, his ability to go through the primary writings of Henry Moore, and he combed through them, from what I can tell, quite extensively. It sounds like he read quite a bit and puts together a very interesting intellectual biography of this idea of divine space as Henry Moore conceived it and then proceeded to argue it and clarify it over the course of his life. Really interesting, and especially in his historical context. So the research there is a lot of Henry Moore, and then a lot of Henry Moore's writings and dialogue with other thinkers and philosophers and stuff at the time. The second half of the book gets a bit wider in scope in terms of the bigger argument about what might this mean in conversation with like post-Einstein physics and today with metaphysical discussions about the absoluteness of God and so on and so forth. So the research widens out a good bit there, but I thought he did a really, really competent job from what I know. Who am I to comment on the kind of expertise of physics and theoretical physics? I've done some reading in that area, but I'm definitely not an expert by any means. But from what I can tell, he does a really, really good job at summarizing. What I really liked is that he summarizes how does this divine space idea, what in the world might that have to do with kind of laying the groundwork for Newtonian physics in a fixed kind of absolute space, and then how might the shift into Einstein's physics really unsettle and destabilize that idea of absoluteness in space, and what in the world might that have to do with physics as we understand it. I thought that was a really, really helpful presentation, and he does a really good job at bringing in those wide areas of thought, and then bringing in the metaphysical questions of like, what does this mean for kind of classical conceptions of God being omnipresent, God being immanent, but still God being transcendent and other, and creation ex nihilo. There's distinctive boundary between the created and the creator. What might all this have to do with this divine space conception? Really, really, really spins through a ton of different areas of thought, and does a great job backing up where needed with citations and research. So, yeah, really impressive on the research front. The readability front. So, again, I keep saying this, but this book is broken into two pretty distinct halves, and so the readability is a little bit worth a comment on each half. The first section is that biographical section. I found that very interesting, if a little bit drier than the second half. The second half, I found myself really engaged quite a bit more. I still found the first half quite interesting, but you really have to be pretty interested in that intellectual biography of a figure like Henry Moore and understanding a little bit of his the context he was working within. So I found the readability there. It's also a lot more of like quotations of primary sources, so your mileage is going to vary with how much you enjoy reading that kind of material. Found it a little bit of I kind of had to like intentionally work my way through that first half a little bit more. The second half I just found because I was so fascinated by the intersection of all these areas of thought and academic debates and metaphysical debates. I'm so interested in all that I just kind of found myself falling through the second half a little bit more. So maybe the readability is a little bit higher on the second half, but it's really going to be driven by your interests, given the way the book is broken up. So lastly, let's get into my reaction. So this is really interesting. My reaction, so I really, really appreciated this book. But how I want to kind of frame my reaction is to say that this is, to be really honest, if I didn't have that connection with Jonathan through previously interviewing him and just being intrigued by kind of the work that he's trying to do through his podcast and his writings, if I didn't have that connection, I don't know that I would have looked this book up. I don't know that I would have read it. I remained, before reading it, I was kind of somewhat cerebrally interested in debates, definitely interested in metaphysics and debates about the classical doctrines of God, very much interested in that stuff, but the way that would have intersected with a figure like Henry Moore, who I really was not on my radar whatsoever, and even theoretical physics more broadly, I went through a phase of being really interested in that when I was in grad school, but I just haven't been reading about theoretical physics for years now, over 10 years now, and it just, again, all I'm just saying, I'm just trying to emphasize that this was just not on my radar. It's not something I probably would have honestly intentionally sought out. And yet I put the book down and I thought, wow, there is really something interesting going on here with Henry Moore's ideas and how this relates. So I think the reason I'm bringing that up in this review is to say that even if you, like me, have no prior necessarily much like previous interest in this topic, or if me talking about the intersection of metaphysics and Henry Moore and classical doctrines of God and Einsteinian physics, if that just seems like so utterly boring to you, you still might put this book down and think, whoa, there's something interesting going on here, because that was my process of going through this. I think, so as to the central idea of the book, I think that what Lyonhart really succeeds at doing is making the argument that at least Henry Moore's ideas deserve a spot at the conversation table, so to speak. They definitely deserve to be put back in the table, and I think he does a really good job at saying that as much as Einsteinian relativity did kind of unsettle the absoluteness of Newtonian physics, it still doesn't totally negate the need for the conversation about the fixedness of space and the absoluteness of space. And then bringing in the layer of doctrines of God and thought and reflection upon who God is, then bringing that layer into it adds just another layer of kind of intrigue and interest. into that whole conversation, because if on some level in theoretical physics we need space needs to be fixed, and then if space itself is, well, if it's absolute, if it's present everywhere, if it's omnipresent, if it's immanent, if it's pressing in on all of us, if all of us are contained, if everything that is contained within space, then on some level all these things that we're using to describe space, on some level it does seem like they kind of start to describe God, especially in a classical sense. And so on some level, then it gets back to Henry Moore's strange idea, which is, what if God is space and space is God? What a crazy question that I had never before reading this book thought to ask. And then I gotta say, like, even I think JD, even over the course of writing the book, a few times he even says, I think he says something effective. I'm not sure I'm convinced by Henry Moore, but I just almost can't shake the possibility of him being right. And so he deserves to be kind of brought back to the table, and this deserves to be kind of a conversation that we all come around and share and engage in. And I think on that level, I totally agree with him. I think that this is such an interesting idea that bears out in so many kind of ways that are really impossible to shake, that it really, the idea of God being space, the notion of divine space, really deserves to be part of this broader conversation as it intersects between physics and metaphysics and theology and doctrine of God. So, wow, all that to say, not something I ever think I would have stumbled on myself or certainly thought of myself, but now that I put the book down, I thought, what a fascinating argument, what a fascinating historical figure, and one that deserves absolutely to be in the conversation. And so that's what Jonathan has accomplished, I think, in this book, Space God. So if that's of interest to you, if anything I just kind of rambled through in that really strange intersection of fields of inquiry, if any of that is of interest to you, then you probably would really appreciate this book, especially that second half that engages in kind of this cross-disciplinary debate. So those are my thoughts on Space God by JD Lyonhart and published by Cascade Books. Thanks, as always, for taking some time to watch.